Right, I guess there's two sort of answers to that, and one has to do with belief structures, which I'll deal with perhaps a little bit later. But the other one, I guess, to think about is the distinctiveness of early Christianity over against the social practices of the time and the groups that practice them. So what other sort of groupings were there? Well, I'll just mention four, for example. There's the local associations, which has been given enormous discussion by Kloppenborg and Harland and Askoff and Last, of course, and they've shown a great deal of commensurate practices with early Christianity. But one then has to ask, why would you bother? If these practices are providing for people's needs, why would you move away from the local associations? And I guess some obvious reasons is that there are distinctives in early Christianity. So in terms of honorific culture, for example, the benefactors and magistrates that might be part of the clubs or sponsoring them get all the glory. Whereas in early Christianity, it's the marginalised and the weak who get honour. Yes, certainly the elites are to be given honour, Romans 13, but there's that different dimension there. In terms of friendship, for example, the kind of language that you'd expect to be dominant in Pauline discourse isn't there, where it is a prominent part of discourse of the associations. So why is it left out? Because it's replaced with something new, koinonia, fellowship of the Spirit. And then you can look at church history for answer. The Ephesian bishop, he's in the 5th century AD, in a sermon, offered free funerals. Well, you had funerals in the associations, but not free. They were part of the membership fees. I'll talk about gymnasia and paideia in a while, but even again in terms of the philosophical schools, for example, there were prominent philosophical schools that one might join, or at least listen to the wandering philosophers who espoused a particular viewpoint. But to again sort of just think about, for example, the Stoics and the attitude of autarkia, self-sufficiency. It internalised a total self-care, whereas the Christians talked about a Christ sufficiency in which they lived, which externalised care for others. So that would have been attractive. And again, if you just think of an unusual approach and to think about ancestral groupings, and here I'm thinking about the elites who want to replicate ancestral glory all the time and to surpass it. Well, again, those achievements are confined to the elites. But once again, the marginalised in early Christian groups are given honour, and they have a new ancestry, of course. The Gentiles moved into the people of Israel, and the people of Israel, of course, now see the flourishing of the faith expanded in exciting ways with the arrival of Christ the Messiah. So there's a whole sort of variety of social reasons, I think, why it would be attractive at that level. Yeah, I think there's certainly a spread of groupings. There's no doubt, for example, at Corinth, there is certainly some. It's not just a rhetorical flourish of Paul. Some who are powerful, but for example, in the case of Thessalonica, they really do seem to be all sort of craftsman based. But again, even in the book of Acts, you have what would be a highly wealthy person in terms of Lydia in Acts 16. And again, you have the mention of significant conversions of synagogue priests and so on. So there's a spread there. So I don't think that Nishka's dismissal of that is correct at all. It's more complicated and subtle than he espouses. Well, I think in the case of the Apostle Paul, we have one who is rhetorically trained, or at least has an incredibly acute ear to rhetoric and has picked up the tricks, if I can put it that way. And similarly with the writer of Hebrews, you have a highly stylised writer who knows all the rhetorical approaches. And then, of course, you've got the Gospel of Mark, which doesn't exactly quite use the same kind of rhetorical finesse, but in terms of narrative management, it's extraordinary. It's very cleverly done, and the puzzling ending, which is, in my view, absolutely at verse 8, is the most extraordinary ending in terms of here is the triumph of early Christianity starting off, and the women all run away afraid. It's just wonderful, and poses the deep ironic question about what is the impact of Christ's death really in that context, and written profoundly pastorally if it's written for an audience that is Roman, who will very soon, or indeed have faced already, the terrible persecution of Nero in 64. So I think there's a great deal of cleverness, and then you see, of course, the differing approaches of gospel writers, bringing in, of course, the Jewish genealogies versus, of course, in Matthew versus Luke, with going back to Adam and so on. These are sophisticated writers who are following biographical conventions, and they are educated and performing writings that are very attractive. To be honest, I don't know, because there is so much that's unattractive. You have a crucified, impoverished benefactor, for example. You have the absolute demolition of boasting, Greco-Roman boasting culture by all writers. I've just realised recently how much that is the case in the Gospel of John, let alone Paul. And you then have, of course, the elevation of the marginalised, God's intentional choice of the weak and poor and so on. So it's very hard to actually understand at one level why people who are wealthy and self-satisfied would want to transfer. But I think the reason is, and it's, for me, it's the most obvious reason of all, is the historical nature of the gospel, that the reliability of the evidence regarding Christ, his ministry, his death, his resurrection and ascension, just poses a fundamental question about who controls the universe. And if you then are faced with evidence that I think is incontrovertible, and obviously the early Christians did, and then to have the experiential aspect of that made known to you through the work of the Spirit in your life, then I think you can start to see why some people shifted. And then as they think about their own giftedness, I'm talking here about rich or educated converts, they can then think about how with their resources they can actually help the church. So Paul uses the singular verb in encouraging the benefactor in Romans 13:4 to give to the Roman Church. That would be some of my guesses. It's a very good question. I think there's obviously connectivity in terms of your trades. There's connectivity in terms of your location. There's connectivity in terms of your friendships. There's attraction because of how people live. There's just the travelling of, for example, Christian businessmen through various cities. How did the gospel, for example, move from Ephesus into the Castris Valley? We don't know. But one way would be by Christian businessmen moving in, doing their business there, and in that sort of connectivity, establishing relationships with clients and the inevitable sharing that would occur from there. So there's just a few sort of examples. Well, in the ancient world, it's primarily, of course, the gymnasium, but there's a variety of places that do teaching. For example, other than the gymnasium, you get teaching at the wrestling schools, the temples devoted to the muses. You would have teachers at the guild halls, for example, the mention of the hall of Tyrannus in Acts. You have synagogues and so on. But it's primarily through the gymnasium, which was fee-paying in classical times. But by the time of the Hellenistic age, public funding of benefactors of those schools had been set up, and indeed Vespasian even set up his own school of rhetoric under Quintilian. So that's the form of education. But even though with public education being instigated, it was still for the elites fundamentally, because the epheboi, the adolescents, who from 15 to 17 were trained. The purpose of the training in the end had military aspects, yes, but was also civic. So here's the rich, wealthy young sons of the aristocrats being trained for the future. And of course, then when you're 18, the Neoi would gain a teaching in humanities and so on. The interesting question is, how much did these attitudes, for example, of education impact the elites at Corinth? And two scholars, Dutch and Brookings, have suggested this, and I think there's a real element of truth to that. They bring with them all these elite attitudes, and you can see that so many of those elite attitudes create the kind of problems that you see in the book of Corinthians. Oh, there's some ones I'd absolutely hate to mention recently, which I've just looked at in terms of Aegean Islands. We have two terrible cases of anti-Semitism, tragically, later on. And that was deeply disturbing for me, to be honest. That's just... Which century? This is in 4th century AD, just later. I think one of the most exciting texts that I've come across, and again relating to Paideia, is the Delphic Canon. Because what it is, it's the ethical curriculum that was taught at the gymnasia. It's a series of 147 imperatives, just commands, and we have them all set out in the 5th century anthology by Stabius, but they were collected by a guy called Sosiades, So he went to Delphi and he copied down all these 147 sayings. They are the sayings of the 7 wise men, the 7 sages of Greece, like Solon of Athens. And what's interesting is they're spread. So they start at Delphi. We have a copy of some of them at Milet Topopoulos, and then we have another copy at Thera, and we have a copy at a place called Canon, where we read on the inscription that the man whose name I'm just forgetting, of course, Clearchus, went to Delphi, copied them all down, and then set them up in his temple, in the temple of Cleinias. And where's Canon? It's in Afghanistan. So they spread from Delphi, this ethical curriculum, right across the Aegean, right across Asia Minor, right into Afghanistan. And here's the ethical curriculum of the elites. And one then has to say, how does the Gospel of Paul, and indeed the ethical commands, particularly you find in the Gospel of Matthew, fit into that context? So I'll give you an example. Rule your wife. Simple. Whereas Paul says, love your wife. And then has the exemplum of Christ loving the church, the cruciform exemplum. And of course, the Delphic Canon gets it right at one level, is unusual at one level because it addresses the male, whereas the household codes normally just address the female. But of course they want to instill in the elites what control of the household really looks like. And what's really interesting is to see how Paul sort of deals with these kinds of texts. If you work through the various themes, I found that absolutely incredible. Just to see Paul confronting ethically the most dominant curriculum, moving from Delphi right across to Afghanistan, and there it all is in his plural commands to a church which is filled with the Spirit. And that is how you fulfill righteousness ethically, because you've been raised from the dead and you count yourself dead and alive to Christ. So the commands are understood in light of what Christ has done and the work of his Spirit in your lives. Whereas in the case of the Delphic Canon, it is all about the nod to the greats of the past and the nods of the greats of the future, i.e. the sons of the elites who will study at the gymnasia and implement these commands. I love the way that New Testament commentators totally ignore the inscriptions by and large. So we are saying in exegesis, for example, in Ephesians, that we can understand Ephesians just by doing a marvellous piece of theological work on the text, and it's brilliantly done. But we don't have to contextualise that at all against the over 3,700 Ephesian inscriptions that we have, and we don't have to bring one of them into dialogue with that letter, whether it's written by Paul or someone else, it doesn't matter. We don't have to bring that into dialogue with the letter. Only one commentator has really done that effectively. Everyone else has ignored it. So what I see my calling is to answer your question, and what excites me is that as we set up the new documents illustrating the history of early Christianity, volumes 11 to 17, we are going to be concentrating on each of the biblical cities. And it is my passion to bring to New Testament scholars translations of these commentaries, of these texts, and commentaries on them, to give them an epigraphic overview of the city, So that's one book of the volume. And then in the second volume, a second book of the volume, you then have thematic essays, again concentrating on the epigraphy, and then also exegetical essays, concentrating on the epigraphy. I've got a decade to do this, if God gives me that long. Absolutely, because how can we determine whether Paul's gospel was merely endorsing commonplaces, whether he's absolutely conservative in his culture, or whether he's radical in his approach, if we don't actually know the contemporary documentation? I then think what we do is just to think about our own culture and reflect about it, and we hope that what we think Paul was saying is actually what's really being said. Whereas, how do we know? The only way is by going back to the original context. And I then think that sharpens up immensely the application to our current context. So that's my passion.